Kia ora, Baz the Tamariki. It is now story time with Mrs. Brown. Today's book will be dedicated to Room 3. Keys of Faith, the Stephen Haskell story, written by Amanda Bews and illustrated by Jade Zivanovic. As I read through the book, try and find this bottle in each picture. Jack stood at the library window and looked out at Albert Park. People were walking their dogs, playing ball, and picnicking in the sunshine. It was the first day of the school holidays, and he wanted to be outside. His dad had said he'd just be a minute, but every kid knew what that meant. Jack sighed and started counting the cars as they drove past on the road below. "Jackie," Dad said, squatting next to him by the window. "Mom won't be finished her exam for a while yet. Let's go get something to eat." Jack grinned. "Did you spot the bottle?" "I thought you were going to look at books all day," he said, as they left the university. "I found some great books for my sermon," Dad said, unlocking the car boot and dropping the bag inside. Jack rolled his eyes. "Hey, if it weren't for libraries, I wouldn't have met your mom." "What do you mean?" Jack asked, wide-eyed. "Well," he said, taking his son's hand across the busy road, "it's our libraries that brought Stephen Haskell here." "Who's Stephen Haskell?" Jack asked as they walked into the park. "I'm so glad you asked because I'll be talking about him on Sabbath." Dad cleared his throat for effect. Back in 1885, 5 men and their families boarded the SS Australia in San Francisco. They were on their way to start the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Melbourne. Even on the ship, they wanted to tell people about Jesus. The missionaries preached sermons, talked to the sailors, and whenever they found an empty bottle, they would roll a tract into it and drop it over the side. Messages in a bottle? I wonder if anyone found any, Jack asked, wide-eyed. "I don't know, but you never know where God may have floated them to." On June the 1st, they docked in Auckland Harbour for a short stopover. That was all it took for Stephen Haskell to fall in love with New Zealand. The group was taken to the top of Mount Eden, which overlooked the city. They thought the view was majestic, but what excited Pastor Haskell the most was all the libraries. In his letter back to the General Conference, he said, "We regard Auckland as the most desirable point for our mission efforts in New Zealand." They sat for a minute on the edge of the fountain in the centre of Albert Park and looked across at the Sky Tower. "I bet it looked different then," Jack said. "Maybe just a little," Dad grinned. After spending a few months in Australia, Pastor Haskell came back to Auckland. He'd been told in Australia that Edward Hare owned a boarding house, that his family were Christians, and they would likely be interested in what the Adventists had to say. Jack raced ahead and pushed the button so that they could cross the road. They waited for the cars to stop. The whole boarding house called Pastor Haskell the Reverend. They thought it was unusual his Sabbath was on Saturday, and he wouldn't eat meat. But he was a kind and gentle man, and they liked him a lot. 2 days after Pastor Haskell arrived, the complaints started. "We like the Reverend," a boarder whispered, "but we think he might be mad. He sits up all night talking to himself, and we can hear a strange clicking sound coming from his room." If it had only been one boarder, then maybe Edward wouldn't have been concerned. But when others began complaining too, he thought he'd better get to the bottom of it. Late one night, he crept up the stairs, tiptoed down the hall, and listened outside Pastor Haskell's door, but heard nothing. Just as he was about to give up and go back to his room, the clicking and murmuring started. He put his ear to the keyhole and couldn't believe what he heard. "What did he hear?" Jack asked as they walked down Mayoral Drive. The line of emerald trees looked mismatched against the starkness of the high-rise buildings. "Well," Dad paused, "Pastor Haskell was praying for Edward and Elizabeth Hare, the guests at the boarding house, and all the people of Auckland." "And what was the clicking sound?" Jack asked curiously. The next morning, Edward confessed to listening at the door and asked Pastor Haskell what the sound was. So Stephen showed him. It was a typewriter, the first one in New Zealand. A typewriter is not special, Jack frowned. Before typewriters, everyone had to write things out by hand, which was very slow. At the time, typewriters were the latest thing. Without someone inventing them first, we wouldn't have computers or tablets, Dad explained. Jack agreed. After that, Edward helped Pastor Haskell organize and run meetings and Bible studies. Soon, many people were interested in the Seventh-day Adventist message. Before returning to Australia, he wanted to make sure the new Adventists would have material to read and share. So he organized the Signs of the Times to be posted from North America to the libraries around New Zealand. What about the rest of Edward's family? Did they help? Jack asked. The Hares lived in a little town north of Auckland called Kaio. Edward wanted his whole family to hear Pastor Haskell's message, so he convinced him to take the boat trip to visit his family. Edward's father Joseph was the leader of a small church of believers there. After discussing the Sabbath with Pastor Haskell, Joseph and Edward's brothers and sisters all decided to become Seventh-day Adventists too. Robert, one of Edward's brothers, was so convinced he decided to go to North America and study to become a Seventh-day Adventist pastor. It didn't take long for Joseph to convert his whole church community, making the congregation in Kaio the first group of worshipping Seventh-day Adventists in New Zealand. The street they were on looked unfamiliar. Where are we going, Dad? We're here, he replied, spreading his arms wide. Jack looked around. It wasn't anything special. A big oak stood its ground against the high-rises and car parks surrounding it, a noiseless nod to a time when Auckland was a quieter, slower place. Jack looked at his dad blankly. This is Turner Street, Dad beamed. And I would say Edward Hare's boarding house stood right about... Dad walked to a place opposite a big dark grey building and rubbed his chin. Here. Dad pulled out his phone and scrolled to an old black and white picture of the boarding house. Jack looked at the large ordinary concrete building that filled the space where Edward's home had once stood. He imagined Pastor Haskell climbing from a horse-drawn cab with his luggage and wondered how he'd felt. Would he have been sad being so far from home? He put an arm around his son. Do you want to get an ice cream before you go to the beach? Yes, please. They sat on the seats in front of the art gallery and watched people rushing past. Dad, Jack asked between licks. Yes, he replied. You said I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for our pioneers. Why is that? Simple, Dad grinned. I met your mom at church. Oh, Dad, Jack laughed. I think she was in the office typing. She's a very fast typist, Dad said, his eyes dancing. Lucky, since she has all those papers to write, Jack added with a grin. Dad looked at his watch. Mom will be finished by now. Let's go meet her. Seagulls screeched overhead as they spread their newspaper of chips on the sand under the ruby blossom-laden Pahutakawa at Mission Bay. The sun sparkled on the water and waves reached to tickle their toes, then rushed back to the ocean. Pastor Haskell had come over 100 years ago from the other side of that very ocean because he wanted to share Jesus with the people of New Zealand. He'd come to a new land with new ideas and new ways to share them. Jack thought about Pastor Haskell's big typewriter and what computers looked like today. He wondered what the next thing would be and asked his mum, I don't know, but do you know who does? Who? Dad? Jack replied. Dad laughed. No, not me, but God does. And he'll know exactly who he can send to use it, Mum added. Maybe that someone will be you. In Proverbs 3 verse 6 it says, in all your ways acknowledge him and he shall direct your paths. The end.